All right, guys, welcome back. We're going to shift gears here and we're going to take a look at industrialization and urbanization. So we've kind of moved on from those founding documents, and now we're going to take a look at how corporations grew, heavy industry, mechanized farming. We're going to look at all of these things and how this transformed our country from an agrarian country to basically an industrialized country. This picture kind of says it all. The top picture is of what the country sort of used to look like, and then the bottom picture is this transformation where we no longer are a country of farms primarily, but we are a country of heavy industry. So the transformation of cities. The way cities tended to grow was that the growth of cities was tied to how closely they were associated with natural resources. So if a city tended to be around a river, or if there was a river in a particular region, cities tended to grow around those particular regions. This map here of Pittsburgh is a great example. So Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania grew up around 3 rivers. And that's why Pittsburgh ended up, because of those 3 rivers, that allowed it to ultimately prosper into this big city. And we know that Pittsburgh was associated with steel. But the steel was moved with those 3 rivers. So within those cities, what you're going to have happen is something called the rise of corporations. All right, the rise of corporations and heavy industry transforms our American economy. All right, and what you need to understand what a corporation is. A corporation is a large company that has a lot of wealth at its disposal because of shareholders who invest their money in the corporation. Keep in mind, these shareholders, or stockholders as they're known, they buy stock. And as a corporation makes more money, that stock becomes more valuable. So it is attractive for these shareholders or stockholders to buy these stocks initially. Corporations during this time period in the 19th century become more and more powerful through something called horizontal and vertical integration. If you look at this chart, you can kind of see what that means. The first thing that happens is we get horizontal integration, which is a corporation essentially buying up the competition. And when they buy up the competition, there's really no one left to stand in their way. But then in order to get full control so that's horizontal integration. However, then to get an even firmer foothold on controlling what people buy, there's something called vertical integration, where not only does a corporation buy up competing companies, but now it is buying up the other resources that it needs in order to build things at a lower cost. So vertical integration would mean you would buy up, let's say you owned a factory that used coal to make something. You would buy up the raw materials, then you'd own the factories, and ultimately you would own the transportation to get things to people. That is vertical integration. And as these corporations become more and more powerful, they gobble up other companies and in essence become a monopoly because there is no other competition to compete against them. And these monopolies become very powerful because if you don't have competition, you can start setting prices and there's no one to compete against you. And so consumers are kind of left with their wallet out paying for these high prices. And what we have are monopolies, or they're also called trusts at the time. These big corporations that controlled everything. So let's move on to something called farm to factory. So if we look at this chart, okay, what we see during this time period of this growth of industrialization is we see a trend. The 1800s continue to become less reliant on agriculture and less reliant on farming. And if you look at this chart, you can see that non-farm workers increase during this time period. More workers end up going into factory jobs. That means and to begin with, farm wages were lower, and so people looked toward the cities and the factories as more of a possibility to begin earning more money. The second chart, or the second graph here on this page, shows the disparity between the average annual income for farm and non-farm workers. And you can see the non-farm workers actually are making more money than the farm workers. And of course, that was another draw to getting people into big cities. Of course, the downside is that a lot of these jobs in these cities were very mundane, very boring, same type of jobs, almost as bad as listening to me talk on and on, but not quite. So we have that issue going on, which keeps things very boring. Next thing I want to talk about is population shifts. I mean, again, this makes more sense. The population is going to shift from rural living to urban living because people want more money. The problem is we have such a huge influx into these urban areas that what you end up getting is unsanitary conditions. You have tenements, which are these large areas where people live. They're crammed in. It's a very bad situation. This picture shows the population density of Chicago as it once was. And you can kind of see the density there. But what you're going to witness is how that density increases. The next picture or chart is going to indicate that that has mushroomed or ballooned to an even greater size because people are just moving in to these urban areas. And here you can see that on this particular picture. Now we have the population growing in leaps and bounds. People crammed in to these small areas. And again, I want to come back to the whole idea that because you have these population areas so tightly crammed together, you are going to be faced with living conditions which are unsanitary and in many cases horrific. Here we've got a picture of just these awful living conditions of people crammed in, trying to make the best that they can in a very tight situation and working in jobs that really are not overly rewarding because they involve doing the same sort of tasks over and over again. So, life in the city. Let's talk about efficient farming. What happens with industrialization is that mechanized farming makes production more efficient. And because it's made more efficient, it is allowing crop prices to stay low. It is actually keeping those crop prices low, which means more people can afford to buy foods. The problem with that is even though the technology is improving the farming, it's also driving down wages because now you can produce stuff more efficiently. Mechanization is driving down people's wages. That's great on the buying end, but if you have depended on a job for your wages, it's not so good. So here we can see some of these improvements. Mechanization brought along the steel plow, which was made by a guy named John Deere. It was not green and yellow at the first point in time as we see them all over. We've also got the mechanical reaper, which was created by Cyrus McCormick. These are all machines that can make more things using fewer workers, using fewer livestock to do the same job, dropping the price of crops, but also dropping the wages of people working in those industries so that they're making less money than us teachers. All right, that was a cheap plug for teaching. All right, so that is how mechanization or industrialization has improved farming, has made it more efficient. Let's take a look at another huge thing, which is the trains. Or the trains, if you're speaking correct English. We can see that there are more and more train tracks built, especially post-Civil War. And of course what that means is you're able to move food more quickly, food that might require refrigeration. More of the country is able to get these foods that it did not have. The train also connects cities. And those cities then also had access to better foods. Essentially, trains connected America. Another thing, more production, more new technology. We've got something called the assembly line, which oftentimes involved a conveyor belt, and different workers did different things along the conveyor belt. I alluded earlier to the fact that these were boring and mundane jobs, and that's exactly what they were. Workers no longer really needed skills to put a screw in a hole and turn it as it was moving down the conveyor belt. It does, however, drop the price of particular goods. And so what that obviously does is it allows more people to be able to afford to buy things because the price of things drops. It makes sense. You need less skilled labor. You don't need to pay as much for that labor. You've got more stuff, which makes sense. That does help to bring the standard of living up. But be careful, obviously, because not everybody's standard of living rose dramatically because wages were somewhat depressed. So yes, many people's standards of living improved, but those that were really poor and working all these jobs, while they were able to acquire more basic things, it's not like they were living like millionaires like I do. All right. So let's talk about some other innovations. All right. There were some huge technological innovations in the late 19th century. Okay. We're talking about the telephone. And in this picture, you can see telephone operators who were largely women going into this. So this did allow women to acquire a new line of work. It opened up those possibilities. Women largely did this work. You can see they sat in front of a board. This was way before the cell phone age, to put it mildly. That was a big new thing. We had the phonograph. And you guys are now recognizing that again with the return of vinyl and people trying to tell you that vinyl sounds better than an MP3, which I refuse to believe, by the way, because I grew up when the vinyl was leaving for CDs, and I'm still convinced, you cannot convince me otherwise, that digital sounds better than that crisp. Anyway, I digress. The light bulb. Big deal. Light bulb. Why is it such a big deal? Well, we obviously know you can turn on a light at night, and that's huge for us to have that light at night. It cuts down on fires when people accidentally forget to put out candles, etc. But in terms of factory production, it allowed factories to also work into the night. So it allows for production to increase, thereby making more and more things available to more people. It allows work hours to be expanded, and it basically allows people to be worked to death longer and longer. But of course, that's important for driving costs down and allowing standard of living to go up in general. Last thing I'll talk about is the washing machine. Thank God. If you've ever washed anything by hand, you're thinking, thank God the washing machine came out. Almost as good an invention as far as I'm concerned as the dishwasher, which I hate doing dishes by hand. But the washing machine also came out during that time. And of course, as we get to the very tail end of the 19th century, more and more innovations. The skyscraper, finally the automobile, and by the time World War I comes around, we've got the airplane coming around. So these things continue during the 19th century.